Gentlemen, it is a pleasure and a privilege to have you both really to kick around and provide some feedback based on you guys' talk that were really incredible. The one thing, Tope, I would really love you to speak to, you really challenge us to think not about geographic change, but about generational change. Talk a little bit about that, a little bit more about that in terms of your thought process.
Yeah, thanks. Well, yeah, I guess where I was coming from there was every time that I had either read about missions or thought about missions, it was very much about being on mission, and mission meant going somewhere else. And so it had a huge geographical emphasis. But then over time, as I began to pastor particularly, I began to realize, okay, yes, we do go to other places, but then what can happen is people right with you could be falling out or away from the gospel. And so our mission is somewhat deficient because it's one directional. It just has geography involved as opposed to having the generations involved. And yes, even if we met everyone in our generation all around the world, which we probably wouldn't, but even if we did, they would all move on and die. Now the question becomes, what do we have on from one generation to another? And when we see God being a God who is both geographical and generational when it comes to missions. And I think the pace of the world in which we live these days, if a generation used to be, I don't know how long, maybe 50 years or something. Now it feels like it's more like 7 years. The pace of change is so rapid and aggressive that if we're not careful, really it takes only one generation to lose a nation, lose a people group. We must make sure that we're making those connections. And those who are in the middle, who are in the those who are in the interim, must be people passing on the right things, particularly in these days of change.
Father Boyle, how does that thought process of changing and focusing on generations impact the way that you focus with Homeboy Ministries?
I wouldn't say that it's a way that I exactly envision things. You want to stay anchored in the present moment, and so Jesus never talks that much about tomorrow except to say, don't worry about it. And so that's kind of the school I'm in. The other thing is that you want to create what the Buddhists would call a sangha, a community of practitioners. So here at Homeboy, it's so wonderful that I don't have to actually run the place anymore. There are a lot of practitioners, homies themselves and homegirls who run the place, who run the bakery, who are navigators, who are case managers. So they carry on a vision of a community of tenderness and a place where people who have been traumatized can feel themselves cherished. So I suppose that creates a generation. I mean, Homeboy has been around for 32 years, and I've been working with gang members for 35, I guess, and things have changed, and we've seen a lot of progress. If we don't see the progress, then I think we're kind of not paying attention. But and that's because you just with each day make progress in the good, and you try to invite people to a kinship such that God might recognize it, and in the end that's compelling because it's what everybody longs to experience anyway.
I think as I hear both of you talk, I think about trauma a lot. And, there's a trauma that we can put our finger on. And then there's a trauma that we would just say, man, this has been my life. So I don't really know anything outside of what a traumatized life looks like. The one thing that I have not seen us as a collective body deal with, the way I've actually heard you talk about it, Father Boyle, and even some of the work that we're doing here is in New York, is working on how do we help people deal with trauma, right? Acknowledge the pain of the past that they've had and not ignore it. Father Boyle, if you were, when you think about trauma, what are some of the most, I guess I would say, important considerations when you're helping someone work through trauma?
Well, I think the main thing is to create a safe place where they can rest. You know, just about every social dilemma, from mental health issues to homelessness to gang intervention, you need to provide a place where they can actually come and find some rest and feel that they are held. And that's a key thing. So it's true that the traumatized are more likely to traumatize. It's equally true that the cherished will be able to find their way to the joy there is in cherishing others. So everyone who comes through our doors comes with what psychologists would call a disorganized attachment. You know, mom was frightening or frightened, and you can't really calm yourself down if you've never been soothed. So then you find yourself soothed in a community that's tender. And so the principle is, if you don't transform your pain, you're just going to keep inflicting it. You'll just keep transmitting it. And so you need to find rest from that. And then you discover the truth of who you are, that you're exactly what God had in mind when God made you. Then you become that truth. You inhabit that truth, and you're newly resilient. And then you break a cycle, because then you bring that home to your kids, and then you're parenting in a way that you weren't. And this is not to blame any parents, but any parent who parents poorly is because they've, you know, they're traumatized and they're damaged and they're wounded and their pain is pervasive. So you want to, you know, break that cycle so that generations, you know, can be liberated from that pain and that trauma.
Tope, when you think about trauma, I think about now, you know, as I turn to all of the racial tension and all the injustice that comes behind it, because you lead, you know, a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-generational church. How are you seeing that type of trauma play out in the midst of your congregation, and kind of what kind of things has your ministry kind of worked through or are working on to help people be more trauma informed?
Well, yeah, that's a good question, big question. You're right. The church, Jubilee, has got all these diversity in it, generational and racial and so on. I think it plays out in very many different ways. You see a kid that is misbehaving, thrown to school, and is such a problem, gets thrown out of school. For when you discover what is done, you'd be like, okay, that just deserves a huge punishment. But you can't stop there. You have to say, well, what else led up to that? And so on. So you have to go further back and on and on and on. And so I think we see that kind of situation. Therefore, you have to work with the family. Therefore, you go further and further back all the time. And each time trying to leverage those who have been blessed to grow up without those difficulties or challenges to use their own wherewithal and well-being to be a part of the solution for other people. I think by God's grace, we've been teaching these things in the church well before now. And so to come to the whole situation that has happened, Black Lives Matter and so on, I think the church was in a good position to not just be inward focused, but to be helpful for other people. Having said that, the trauma is just multidimensional. It's funny, right through the whole thing, my own son, we're talking about the whole Black Lives Matter thing. My son was telling the story about when he first recognized there's a problem. It was him and I are in a car, we're going to a prayer meeting, a policeman stops me driving. And I stop, and any problem officer, he says, well, where are you going? What are you doing? He does all the usual questions, all the checks. Wasn't aggressive, wasn't nasty, wasn't unkind. but just had questions to interrogate. Well, I gave him all the answers, and then he says, well, I see you're a very gentle person, everything's fine, you can go, but you understand, I see you're a black man with a hat and you have a child beside you, obviously I have to stop you. Now, that was the reason he stopped me. And now and the thing is, for my son, that was, he couldn't he's like, I don't understand. He was 10 years old. Why are we being stopped? He said, because you're black and because I'm with my dad, this is a problem. The policeman was Caucasian, by the way. Now, that was a problem for my son, a big problem. Here's the thing, for me, I'm trying to show you the difference in generations, how they've handled some of these tensions. My own generation, me, kind of thought, you know what, it's just one of those things, get on with life, work hard, and just do good and go on. The next generation think, no, this is just injustice. It's not just, it's not right. Now, when that generation, like my son, now grow up to where now they've been to university, they get looking for jobs and on, they realize, wait a minute, nothing is equal here. And so you have in them, my son is a Christian, serving the church, preaches, all of that. You realize there's an anger in them because of the injustice that has happened. And so that cannot be ignored. I listened to some of the things that the father here said, just absolutely, just fantastic, a huge blessing I felt, because it really, just when he talked about, you know what, you go to those hurting for you to get healed yourself. I think that's it's a flip around from the way things are usually seen. It's not just about let's go help people on the other side. It's actually, we're all broken in different ways. Let me go over there while I'm helping. I'm going to be ministered to myself. And I think all that dynamic works when we think of I want to be a safe person. Okay, so come to the latter part of your question. How has the church been handling this? What do I teach? You be a safe person as best you know how. And then I want to create a safe place where they can come. And me as a pastor being a safe person means, you have to kick out anything that looks like rock star, prima donna, stage mentality, concert church. All those things are antithetical to the very simple gospel we were given by God. That every leader needs to be completely approachable and not so stunned by what people have done that is so wrong, but be so accommodating so that they can open up. And then, a safe place. And once they begin to open up, I want to then put them in among safe people who are, and some of the safest people are the most broken people. Honestly, for me as a pastor, if you really want to know where I go to keep my soul tender, it's not a church conference. It's not a Christian conference. I go to the AA meetings. Really, I have people I sponsor. I go with them to an AA meeting. They are ruthlessly open. Ruthlessly open. They'll talk about everything they've done wrong. They'll even come next following week and say it all over again. And you see what real brokenness looks like, and that makes you think of your own brokenness, and now you truly want to help, not as a charity case or cheap welfare, but true justice as Jesus did.
Oh, that's fantastic. The one thing I think about this a lot. I think about the ways that we dichotomize the gospel, right? I think about the ways that people would say, well, I don't want this to become a social gospel. And my response usually is, what other gospel is there? If Jesus grew in wisdom, stature, favor with God and with people, he had a growth process that cut through his education, through his physical sustainability, through his spiritual heritage, and his social narrative. And so that was all an inclusive gospel. So when you're meeting a traumatic need or an addictive need or whatever need you think, like, that is meeting the need through the lens of the gospel, but we've had such a tendency to chop up what is and what isn't the gospel instead of embracing, Tope, what you talked about at the beginning, the simplicity of the gospel message played out in simplicity in the context of lives that people, as people are living them, where they're living them, whether they're gang members or whether they're in AA meetings or whether they've just got a broken and fragmented childhood that they can't get through. Addressing those needs are all the gospel.
I want to open it up for more questions for Paul Coty. Can you talk more about that?
You know, I think the justice issue is bigger than people have actually given it credit for. There are several injustices that people have a tendency to want to explain away instead of embrace. And when you explain it away, you actually begin to strip the dignity that other people have when you downplay the injustice that they're currently experiencing. Justice is a tricky thing because if we're honest, true justice can only come from, you know, the creator and the authenticator of justice, which is God. Because when you look at justice, justice talks about removing bias and making decisions so that people can actually have what they belong, what they actually deserve, and then go on to enjoy what they deserve. It is not justice if I give you something you deserve and you can't enjoy it. That's still propagating the same injustice that we've talked about over time. And so, you know, Father Boyle, I love when you talked about severed belonging, because really when you look at injustice, injustice is severed belonging. You have taken something from someone that they actually deserve to have. And that takes place in several segments. When you look at, you know, whether you talk about police brutality or you talk about housing injustice and inequity, when you talk about prison systems, those things are very large, but because people have trouble having an authentic lens and view of justice, you know, we just continue a process of stripping justice away from people.
You know, I subscribe to the notion of the bigger we. At what point do you feel like the table will need to be enlarged? We've got a big table right now, so that we can reach the how many thousands of kids we have in our sites. There are 2 million teens that we're trying to reach.
Yep.
At what point will the table need to be made larger to increase the bigger we?
Man, I think, Carolyn, I think about that in terms of Thanksgiving, and here's what I mean. Before Thanksgiving, your table is small, right? Your table is, you know, a smaller size. And Thanksgiving and other holidays hit. And when the holidays hit, you add a leaf or two to broaden out the table. And for, I don't know, then you decide after a month or so, after a couple of weeks, it's like, you know what, the next holiday is coming or the next event is coming. So I'm just going to leave the leaves in and allow the table to be bigger. I really do think that time is now to leave the leaves in the table so that the table can remain bigger. Carolyn, at some point, I think it's also time to get a new table, because you can only seat, you're going to run out of capacity at some point. And so either you need a new table or you need multiple tables for people to sit at. I think we're getting to the stage where it's not a new table. We need multiple tables, because there will never be one table that will be big enough to seat everybody, right? If you go to a wedding or other events in a banquet hall, it's not just one large table because it doesn't have capacity. The room has capacity. The table doesn't have it. I think our room, right, has capacity. Now we need more tables so that we're able to sit and seat. You know, when you talk about people who live and work on the margins, you know, you think about somebody from Children's Village or from Queens Village or from Chinatown or, you know, or from Crown Heights, who are now sitting around a table differently. Not the original table, probably is not going to look the same. One table is going to have that great architectural design, and the table next to it is probably going to have graffiti on it, right? Or the table beside that is going to have some sort of stain or what we would say a discoloration, so it doesn't match. But there are going to be multiple tables that give everyone an opportunity to sit at the table who wants to be there. Man, that whole notion of severed belonging, oh my goodness. That's absolutely mind-blowing and game-changing, because when you think about that, that addresses how you see the table, right? You set up new tables for people who have had their belongings severed, so it creates space for them, and so they still are being reconnected to community. So that's, I mean, even on this call, Carolyn, a lot of my, you know, as you begin to percolate, as you're thinking the question out loud, my mind is still trying to settle, and I'm really answering the question live as those new thoughts are forming in me.
One of the things I think is a strength of your leadership is that radical kinship that Father Gregory Boyle really outlines in his second book, but it's also just something I've experienced as a strength of your leadership. Like everyone comes in touch with you here in the city on their staff role, and they feel like they're at family, they're home. Well, I feel like that's been true. Okay, we're getting some head nods, you know what I'm saying? I'm not alone in that. And so I just wanted you to talk a little bit more about how did you come to that as a way of leadership, as a way of living out your life, and yeah, and maybe an encouragement to those who want to lead that way.
Wow. Family has always been a big thing for me. And so no matter where I went, family was a value. Growing up, not only did I have, 4 other siblings, but we had people who were boarders who lived in our house. Now, we didn't have much, so they were on the floor like we were, but I had a white guy by the name of Derek Johnson, who was on my couch for almost a year. And I had another guy from the neighborhood, not the hood, the neighborhood. We didn't have hoods like that. So, and that they came and stayed with us. When their parents put them out, they came to our house. And my mom would have a conversation with those parents, and they would stay with us. And so I learned to kind of enlarge my tent pretty early on, before ministry was a thing. I would say my greatest gift is probably not what everybody would say, right? I feel like my greatest gift is connecting people to opportunity. But when that happens, that's a family thing for me, right? Because connecting anybody who's family to make sure that they get the family hookup is what I've always thought about. So when I first started thinking about how New York City would be built, it was, hey, let me call a bunch of my friends who I know who had done ministry but didn't have a platform. That's where it all started. And then what happened from there is you guys began doing that. So as much as you would say I've embodied and created family, I would say that's partially true. Because once you guys caught on to it, you guys actually enlarged the family. So here's the practicality of it. The first flight school we had 8 people in that flight school, right? The following flight schools, The last flight school we did, we ended at 35 people in flight school. That was only because you guys began to embody that family network and started pulling and inviting people that you knew. I think it's been the greatest gift of my life has been being able to watch how the family has grown, and to have the, Pete will recognize this, to have the Michael Jordan moment where you just kind of like this, unless the Lord had actually done it, it doesn't really happen. I think I've just had the opportunity to really follow the track that he's put us on, and it's just happened to invite plenty of people to the table. I mean, back to Carolyn's initial question, I think part of that new table and creating space was giving people the freedom to create new paradigms on things that I wouldn't normally think about. And I think that was the biggest chore I had in building the family was I going to be the godfather, right? Who made sure everything moved the way I said it did, or was I going to move like the Untouchables, where the Untouchables had a family of people who helped make decisions, and that was the biggest chore. And once I was able to settle that, having people having a seat at the table was not as valuable as them having a voice at the table, that changed everything.
I think even as we look at the times moving forward, one of the things that you talked about in your message about listening without being defensive. And, it's one thing when we talk, and sometimes we do this even as Christians, we talk about going from point A to point B, and we don't really harbor on the process of that and the difficulties, because if it was so simple, it wouldn't be needed to be said. Can you talk about practically how we could go about listening without being taken defense, also with the mindset of you feeling not heard yourself?
Man, I think, the practicality to listening without being defensive really starts before you enter the room. It really is a prayerful thing. Like, you have to walk into a room with the understanding that there are going to be some things for you that are actually hard for you to hear, right? You have to know going in the room, it's going to be difficult when I hear this statement, or this statement is going to trigger me or cause me to be defensive, right? I'm going to hear there are some things that have happened in the past that, because it's connected to my people group, it's going to be hard for me to hear, even though I wasn't personally involved in it. And so it's almost like an out-of-body experience, P, because you've got to distance yourself you have to distance yourself from all of the things historically that you've held dear if you're going to listen in a way where you don't become defensive. I would say that's not only difficult when we talk about matters of history and matters of race, that's difficult in matters of marriage and relationship. You are invariably going to hear some things that are very hard for you to hear. And Paul, you know this guy, Gene Red. If there are two patients in the room at the same time, nobody ever gets well. So there has to be a doctor and a patient. You cannot be a patient at the same time, or you can't be a doctor at the same time, because everybody is either trying to figure out the cure or to figure out who hurts the most. So when you go in, if you're going to prevent yourself from being defensive, you have to go in practically with a different mindset. And then the permission to actually stop yourself while you're in the middle of it. Like, if you hear yourself going that way, the permission to say, okay, let me gather myself. I'm getting defensive right now. I apologize. And then you start over and you start re-listening again. P, what was the second part? Because that was a mouthful. The second part was a big question.
The second part was when you feel like you're not being heard. So as you talked about the doctor-patient but you're always doctor and never patient.
So you've got to create a space for yourself where you can actually be the patient. You just can't be the patient with the person in the room that you're supposed to be the doctor with, right? So when you leave that room, that's been difficult for you to hear some things, then you take yourself to another room where you can actually be heard. Because at some point, the person that you've been the doctor with will actually also become the person that becomes the doctor to you over time. But until you get to that place, you've got to make sure you have safe places for you to get to that's outside of the context that you're hearing everything with. That's why everybody says if you're going to be in counseling, your first step to being a counselor is you've got to be counseled yourself. Or I know this for sure, they will not license you in social work or as a social worker or as a counselor until you've actually gone through counseling yourself to work on your own stuff. And so the counselor always has a path to go to. I've always thought about this, Paul, like how does a pastor, right? How does a pastor get what he or she needs when they're pastoring people, right? If they're going to be healthy, that means that they have to have a pastor for themselves or a network for themselves that helps them work through their own stuff. So in your video about injustices, your first two steps are to bring it to the front and to listen and sit in it as well. Just hearing you talk about the table, do you have any tips as a person who is starting to really dig deep into their culture, their family upbringing, and especially transitioning that into ministry, as well as speaking up in an organization? Do you have any tips for someone who has recently pulled their chair to the table in a very large table and looking to speak up? Joshua 1:8 says, be strong and very courageous. I think as you pull your chair to the table, it takes courage to say what you're going to say because you're not sure if what you're going to say is valued or if you're actually the right person to say it. If it's on your heart, the thing you have to think about is how you say it, not if you should say it. If you're at the table, then you should have a voice at the table. If you don't have a voice at the table, you should leave the table that you're sitting at. And I mean that with all sincerity. And find a table where your voice has meaning and value. And so that would be the first thing I would say is use courage and say what needs to be said. I would say the second thing is, scripture talks about studying to show ourselves approved. A good student always makes a good teacher. And so as you get to the table, as you get ready to articulate what you feel like needs to be brought to the table, make sure you've done your homework before you get there. Because invariably, someone is going to have something to say about what you just brought to the table. And they're going to challenge what you just brought to the table. The only way to combat that or to be prepared for that is to be a good student before you actually sit down so that you can turn yourself into a teacher at the table, because that's really what you want to be.
So you mentioned, Paul, that reconciliation will always cost you something. And that kind of sat with me. It was a loaded statement for sure. I think all of us are in a different journey and space when it comes to reconciliation, justice, and mercy. It's a process. We're all in different places, right? My question to you would be, speaking about our young life leaders, what would your charge and challenge be for them? Like as maybe some initial steps forward to lean into those spaces, whether some may be more comfortable than others. How would you kind of challenge them to start moving forward towards leaning into those harder spaces, harder conversations, some of the things that we've already been talking about? Wow.
I would echo, I'd start by saying this, we've talked about reconciliation as if it was easy. Hey, be reconciled to your brother. Oh, that's easy. But when Christ reconciled, it cost him his life to reconcile us. That wasn't easy. And so part of it is the understanding that reconciliation is not a one-step process. And it's not going to be easy. I've used this paradigm over a lot of years. And, I talk about it through the lens of Luke 15. It's decide what you want, determine what it costs, and pay the price, right? All reconciliation, it really begins with the decision. It is, do I see where things are broken, and do I have the courage to even see that it needs to be reconciled? But once you get there, you have to decide that you want it and figure out what it's going to cost you to do it. How much time, what kind of time is it going to cost me? What kind of process? What am I going to have to acknowledge in the process to reconcile? What hard things am I going to have to hear? But also, what hard things am I going to have to say? We usually think about reconciliation. We think about it in terms of forgiveness. We have to go and we have to hear someone say some hard things and they forgive us. No, not all the time. There are some things that have been done to us that we actually have to be in position to be able to talk about and to have someone ask forgiveness of us. And oftentimes that's more difficult than receiving it, than giving it, right? Where we say, man, I'm going to ask you to forgive me for what I did. It is very difficult, on the other hand, to have someone say, will you forgive me for X? And what we usually do is we dismiss it and say it's not a big deal. No. It really is a big deal. And reconciliation is going to cause us to have to sit, as you said, Erica, sit in some things that we don't want to sit in if we want to get to the end. Reconciliation, again, we have to admit we're wrong about some things that we have held to for a long time, that we were actually right. No, we weren't right. We weren't. And we've got to have the courage to say we weren't, and I recognize it. And I'm sorry. And I know that it's cost us a lot of our relationship and our time. And in order to be reconciled, I'm going to have to go and approach that sibling, that spouse, that particular kid, that leader. I think the last thing I'd say about it is people have experienced a significant amount of trauma around some of the things that require reconciliation. And until we dive into some of the trauma, reconciliation is going to be hard to get to.
Wow, you guys, well, thank you so much. We are wrapping now. We are wrapping this portion of our summit. I want to also say thank you so much to the people on our team, our roundtable guests. Thank you guys so much for jumping on and asking good questions.
Thank you for having us. It's a pleasure.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you so much for joining in with us today. I just want to remind us of our theme and the truth of the place where we're doing ministry from. We are better together. And it's good and godlike to do this work this way, to celebrate diversity, belonging, and to be inclusive. Not just because Young Life says, but because it's God's command and actually his idea when he started this whole thing. Okay. So I just want us to be reminded that if we look at the person of Jesus, he comes to us, even looking like us, human, and then he opens up this saving work to everyone, Jew, Gentile. He's found pursuing the outcast. He's found inviting and empowering women in his ministry. He's inviting the religious and the pagan, the marginalized. He calls everyone to come, all of his beloved. And so we've been here getting on board with that. And the invitation is to you to do that also. Thank you so much for listening. And I pray you enjoy the rest of your day. Have a good day, and I'll talk to you all very soon.